The courtroom was a sea of murmurs. A tense hum rising from polished benches as billionaire Charles Wentworth leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, refusing to stand for the black judge who had just entered. Judge Eleanor Harris, her robes flowing like a quiet storm, paused at the bench, her piercing gaze locking onto him. In that frozen moment, the air thickened with defiance and authority. A silent clash that promised something extraordinary was about to unfold. A moment that would ripple far beyond the marble walls of justice. The mahogany-paneled courtroom smelled faintly of old wood and wax, its high ceilings amplifying every whisper into a soft echo that seemed to linger like a memory. Charles Wentworth sat at the defendant's table, his tailored suit crisp, his silver cufflinks glinting under the fluorescent lights. At 52, he was a man who commanded boardrooms, his name synonymous with wealth built on tech empires and real estate fortunes. His sharp jaw was set, his blue eyes cold as he scanned the room with the detached confidence of someone who believed rules were for others. Today, he faced a civil lawsuit. A former employee, a woman named Clara Thompson, claimed wrongful termination after exposing safety violations at one of his factories. To Charles, it was a nuisance, a mosquito to be swatted away with his legal team's prowess. But the courtroom felt different today, heavier, as if the walls themselves were watching. Judge Eleanor Harris stepped through the chamber doors, her presence shifting the room's gravity. At 47, she carried herself with a quiet strength, her dark skin glowing under the soft light, her eyes sharp with the wisdom of someone who had seen both the best and worst of humanity. Her robes moved with her like a shadow, and as the bailiff called for all to rise, the room obeyed, except for Charles. He remained seated, his posture a deliberate statement, his lips curled into a faint smirk. A ripple of gasps spread through the gallery. Clara, seated at the plaintiff's table, clutched her hands tightly, her knuckles paling. She was 34, a single mother with tired eyes and a stubborn streak that had led her to this moment, daring to challenge a titan. Her attorney, a wiry man named Daniel Foster, shot her a glance, his face a mix of worry and resolve. Eleanor's eyes found Charles, and for a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. She didn't flinch, didn't raise her voice. Instead, she stood at the bench, her hands resting lightly on its edge, and let the silence stretch. It was a silence that felt alive, heavy with the weight of history, power, and unspoken questions. Charles shifted slightly, his smirk faltering as her gaze held him, unyielding. The bailiff, a stocky man named Tom, hesitated, unsure whether to repeat the command. The gallery, filled with reporters, court regulars, and a few of Clara's supporters, leaned forward, sensing a moment that could tip into legend. Eleanor's face remained calm, but there was a fire in her eyes, a spark that suggested she had faced defiance before and knew exactly how to meet it. Clara's heart pounded as she watched the standoff. She had spent months preparing for this case, pouring her savings into legal fees, driven by a need to prove that people like her, ordinary, hard-working, invisible to men like Charles, mattered. She remembered the factory, the grinding hum of machines, the acrid smell of chemicals that clung to her clothes. She had been a quality control supervisor, diligent, proud of her work until she'd uncovered corners cut, safety protocols ignored. When she reported it, she was fired within days, her life upended. Now, sitting here, she felt small, her navy blazer secondhand, her shoes scuffed. But seeing Charles's arrogance, his refusal to stand, lit something fierce in her. She glanced at Daniel, who gave her a subtle nod, as if to say, "We're in this." Eleanor finally spoke, her voice steady, resonant, cutting through the tension like a blade. She didn't address Charles directly but instead began the proceedings, her words precise, her authority unquestionable. She outlined the case, her tone professional yet warm, as if reminding everyone that justice wasn't just a concept but a living, breathing thing in her courtroom. Charles's legal team, a trio of polished attorneys led by a man named Richard Holt, exchanged glances. They had advised Charles to settle, but he'd refused, confident his wealth could bury Clara's claims. Now, as Eleanor spoke, Richard's brow furrowed. He sensed something in her demeanor, a resolve that money couldn't sway. The first witness was called, a former co-worker of Clara's named Margaret Evans, a wiry woman in her 40s with a nervous habit of twisting her wedding ring. Margaret's testimony was halting but honest, describing the factory's unsafe conditions, the pressure to stay silent. As she spoke, Clara's mind drifted to late nights at the kitchen table, her daughter Lily asleep upstairs, while she pored over documents, fighting despair. She had always taught Lily to stand up for what was right, but doing so now felt like walking a tightrope over a void. Charles, meanwhile, doodled on a legal pad, his face a mask of boredom, but his eyes flicked occasionally to Eleanor, as if trying to gauge her. Eleanor listened intently to Margaret, her pen moving swiftly across her notes. She asked pointed questions, her voice gentle but firm, drawing out details Margaret hadn't realized she remembered. The gallery hung on every word, the air thick with anticipation. Clara felt a flicker of hope, but also fear. Charles's wealth was a shadow that loomed over her, a reminder of how easily power could crush the truth. Yet Eleanor's presence was a counterweight, a beacon of fairness in a world that often bent toward the powerful. As the session broke for recess, Charles stood, finally, but not for Eleanor. He strode toward the exit, his attorneys trailing, his demeanor unchanged. Clara watched him go, her stomach twisting. She turned to Daniel, whispering, "He doesn't care, does he?" Daniel's jaw tightened, but before he could answer, Eleanor's voice called out, calm yet commanding, addressing the room but somehow piercing straight to Charles's back. What she said next sent a jolt through the courtroom, a moment that would be whispered about for years to come. Eleanor's voice, though soft, carried the weight of a gavel as she called out, "Mr. Wentworth, this court operates on respect, for the law, for its officers, and for the people it serves. You will do well to remember that." The words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate, slicing through the murmur of the courtroom like a sudden gust of wind. Charles froze mid-step, his broad shoulders stiffening under his tailored jacket. For a moment he didn't turn, his silhouette framed against the double doors, as if weighing whether to acknowledge her. The gallery held its breath, reporters scribbling furiously, their pens scratching like tiny heartbeats. Clara's eyes widened, her hands clenching the edge of the table, while Daniel leaned forward, his expression a mix of awe and caution. Charles slowly turned, his face a mask of controlled irritation, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. He offered a curt nod, barely perceptible, before pushing through the doors, his attorneys scrambling to keep pace. The courtroom exhaled, the tension breaking like a wave. Eleanor returned to her notes, her composure unshaken, as if she hadn't just called out one of the most powerful men in the room. Clara felt a surge of something unfamiliar, hope, perhaps, or the faint stirrings of belief that justice might not bend to wealth after all. As the recess began, she and Daniel stayed seated, the weight of the moment settling over them. The gallery buzzed with whispers, the air thick with speculation about what Eleanor's words meant for the case. Clara's mind raced, replaying the standoff, the way Eleanor's gaze had held Charles like a spotlight on a stage. She wondered what it cost Eleanor to carry that kind of strength, to stand unwavering in a room that expected her to falter. Outside, in the marble corridor, Charles lit a cigarette, ignoring the no-smoking signs, the faint scent of tobacco curling around him like a defiance of the rules. Richard Holt, his lead attorney, approached cautiously, his polished shoes clicking on the floor. "Charles, that was unwise," Richard said, his voice low, urgent. "Judge Harris isn't someone you provoke. She's known for fairness, but she doesn't tolerate disrespect." Charles exhaled a plume of smoke, his eyes narrowing. "She's just a judge, Richard. I've dealt with worse." But his tone lacked its usual certainty, and Richard noticed, his brow creasing. Charles flicked the cigarette to the ground, grinding it under his heel, and walked away, his mind already spinning strategies to reclaim control. Back in the courtroom, Clara sipped water from a paper cup, her hands trembling slightly. Daniel leaned closer, his voice a quiet anchor. "She's got his number, Clara. That's a good sign." Clara nodded, but her thoughts drifted to her daughter, Lily, who was staying with Clara's sister during the trial. She pictured Lily's gap-toothed smile, her small hand clutching a crayon as she drew pictures of their old apartment, the one they'd lost after Clara's firing. The memory stung, a reminder of why she was here, fighting a man who saw her as a footnote. She glanced at Eleanor, who was now speaking quietly with the bailiff, Tom, her face softened but still resolute. Clara wondered about Eleanor's life outside these walls. What battles she'd fought to sit at that bench, what scars she carried beneath her robes. When the session resumed, the next witness took the stand. A former factory manager named Paul Grayson, a heavy-set man in his 50s with a nervous tic in his jaw. Paul had worked under Charles for a decade, loyal until Clara's firing forced him to question the company's practices. His testimony was measured, his voice low as he described the pressure from above to ignore safety violations, the late-night calls from executives demanding silence. Eleanor listened intently, her pen pausing only to ask questions that cut to the heart of his words, drawing out details he hadn't planned to share. Clara felt a knot in her chest loosen as Paul spoke, his words painting a picture of a workplace where profit trumped people, where her warnings had been dismissed as inconvenient. Charles, back at his table, maintained his air of indifference, but his fingers tapped restlessly on the armrest. His attorneys took notes, their faces tight, aware that Paul's testimony was damaging. Richard leaned over, whispering something, but Charles waved him off, his eyes fixed on Eleanor. He was used to bending the world to his will, but here, in this room, he sensed a force he couldn't easily manipulate. Eleanor's questions were precise, her tone never accusing but relentless, peeling back layers of truth like skin from an onion. The gallery felt it too, the atmosphere charged with the slow unraveling of Charles's carefully constructed image. Clara's mind wandered to the day she was fired, the memory vivid as a fresh wound. She'd been called into a glass-walled office, the city skyline gleaming behind her supervisor, a man who avoided her eyes as he slid a termination letter across the desk. The words "budget cuts" rang hollow, a lie she saw through instantly. She'd walked out, her ears ringing, the factory's hum fading as she stepped into a world that felt suddenly vast and hostile. Now, in this courtroom, she felt that same vastness, but Eleanor's presence anchored her, a lighthouse in a storm. She glanced at Daniel, who was scribbling notes, his pen moving with quiet determination. "We've got a shot, don't we?" she whispered. He met her eyes, his nod steady. "More than a shot." As Paul stepped down, Eleanor called a brief pause to review documents, her hands moving with the grace of someone who knew the weight of every page. The courtroom settled into a restless quiet, the air heavy with anticipation. Clara watched Charles, who was now conferring with his team, his gestures sharp, his voice a low growl. She wondered what drove a man like him, what made him sit so defiantly, as if the world owed him its allegiance. She thought of Eleanor, too, imagining the battles she must have faced to reach this bench, the silent strength that carried her through moments like this. The day was far from over, and Clara sensed that the real turning point was yet to come, a moment that would test them all in ways they couldn't yet foresee. The courtroom's fluorescent lights cast a sterile glow, but the air felt charged, as if the walls themselves were bracing for what came next. Judge Eleanor Harris sifted through a stack of documents, her movements deliberate, each page turned with the precision of someone who understood its power. Clara Thompson sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands folded tightly, the faint scent of her lavender hand cream mingling with the polished wood around her. She felt the weight of the moment, the slow build of something monumental, like the first rumble of a distant storm. Charles Wentworth, across the room, leaned back in his chair, his face a mask of practiced calm, but his fingers betrayed him, drumming lightly on the table's edge. His legal team, led by Richard Holt, whispered urgently among themselves, their briefcases open like arsenals preparing for battle. The gallery, packed with reporters and onlookers, buzzed with a restless energy, their murmurs a low hum that seemed to pulse with the courtroom's heartbeat. Eleanor called the next witness, a young engineer named Sarah Bennett, who had worked alongside Clara at the factory. Sarah, barely 30, walked to the stand with a nervous gait, her dark hair pulled back tightly, her eyes darting toward Clara for a fleeting moment of reassurance. Clara offered a small, encouraging nod, remembering the late nights they'd spent together, poring over safety reports, their voices hushed as they uncovered violations that could cost lives. Sarah's testimony began haltingly, her voice soft but gaining strength as she described the factory's conditions. Leaking pipes, faulty machinery, ignored warnings. She spoke of Clara's persistence, how she'd stayed late to document every infraction. Her determination a quiet fire that inspired Sarah to speak up too. The words landed like stones in still water, each one rippling through the room, stirring the gallery into whispers. Charles's expression remained impassive, but his eyes narrowed slightly, a predator sizing up a threat. He leaned toward Richard, muttering something that made his attorney's jaw tighten. Richard scribbled a note, passing it to his team, their faces grim. Clara watched them, her stomach twisting. She knew Charles's playbook: intimidation, deflection, the kind of power that made truth feel like a luxury she couldn't afford. But Sarah's voice, steady now, was a lifeline, each word pulling Clara closer to the hope that her fight wasn't futile. She glanced at Daniel Foster, her attorney, who was listening intently, his pen poised over his legal pad, his eyes bright with focus. He caught her look and gave her a subtle thumbs up, a gesture that felt like a hand on her shoulder. Eleanor's questions to Sarah were sharp yet kind, guiding her through the testimony with the skill of someone who knew how to unearth truth without breaking the person delivering it. She asked about specific incidents: a chemical spill that had sent 2 workers to the hospital, a machine breakdown that Clara had flagged months before it failed. Sarah's answers were clear, her voice trembling only when she described the day Clara was fired, how the factory's atmosphere shifted, fear silencing those who had once supported her. Eleanor nodded, her face unreadable but her eyes warm, as if she saw not just the witness but the human being beneath the nerves. The gallery leaned forward, sensing the case's momentum shifting, the weight of Sarah's words tipping the scales. Clara's mind drifted to her daughter, Lily, whose laughter had been her anchor through the darkest days. She pictured Lily's small hands clutching a stuffed rabbit, her questions about why Mommy was always so tired, so worried. Clara had shielded her from the worst, but the strain of the lawsuit, the sleepless nights, had etched lines into her face that no mirror could hide. She wondered what Lily would think years from now, knowing her mother had stood up to a man like Charles. The thought gave her strength, but also a pang of fear. What if she lost? What if Charles's wealth crushed her, as it had so many others? She pushed the thought away, focusing on Sarah, whose testimony was now painting a vivid picture of a workplace ruled by profit over people. Charles, meanwhile, was growing restless. His fingers stopped drumming, his hand curling into a fist as Sarah recounted a meeting where he dismissed safety concerns with a wave, saying, "Risk is part of growth." The words, repeated now in court, hung heavy, drawing gasps from the gallery. Richard leaned over, whispering urgently, but Charles's eyes were locked on Eleanor, as if trying to will her into submission. Eleanor, however, was unmoved, her gaze steady as she directed Sarah to clarify details, her voice a calm anchor in the rising tide of tension. Clara noticed a faint smile on Eleanor's lips, not of amusement but of resolve, as if she knew the power of the truth being laid bare. As Sarah stepped down, the courtroom felt smaller, the air thick with the weight of what had been said. Eleanor called for a brief pause to admit new evidence, a stack of internal emails Clara had saved, proof of the company's negligence. The emails, projected on a screen, were stark, their corporate jargon unable to hide the callousness of decisions made at the top. One email, from Charles himself, instructed managers to prioritize output over complaints. The gallery erupted in murmurs, reporters typing furiously, their screens glowing with the promise of headlines. Clara's heart raced, her hands clammy as she realized the impact of those words, the way they stripped Charles's facade bare. Charles's face darkened, his composure cracking like thin ice. He leaned toward Richard, his voice a low growl, but Richard's response was a sharp shake of his head, a warning to stay silent. Clara watched, her breath shallow, feeling the tide turning but knowing the fight was far from over. Eleanor, reviewing the emails, made notes with a steady hand, her face betraying nothing but focus. Clara wondered what drove her, what inner fire allowed her to face men like Charles without flinching. She imagined Eleanor's life, perhaps a family, perhaps solitary evenings with case files, perhaps her own battles against a world that doubted her. The thought made Clara sit taller, her resolve hardening. As the session neared its close, Eleanor addressed the court, her voice clear, carrying the weight of authority and compassion. She spoke of the case's importance, not just for Clara but for everyone who believed in accountability. Her words were measured, but they landed like a challenge, a reminder that justice wasn't a gift but a right. Charles shifted in his seat, his eyes flicking to the gallery, then back to Eleanor, as if realizing for the first time that this courtroom wasn't his domain. Clara felt a spark of hope, fragile but fierce, as the day ended with the promise of more to come, a battle that was only beginning to reveal its true stakes. The courtroom's air felt heavier now, thick with the scent of old paper and the faint hum of anticipation, as if the walls themselves were leaning in to witness the unfolding drama. The late afternoon light filtered through high windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor, where dust motes danced like silent spectators. Clara Thompson sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles ached, the faint tremor in her fingers betraying the storm of emotions within. She could still hear the echo of Judge Eleanor Harris's words from the previous session, a call for accountability that had left the gallery buzzing and Charles Wentworth visibly unsettled. Now, as the court reconvened, Clara felt the weight of the moment, a pivotal turn in a fight that had consumed her life for months. Across the room, Charles sat rigid, his tailored suit immaculate but his eyes restless, darting between his attorneys and the bench. His lead counsel, Richard Holt, adjusted his tie, his face taut with the strain of a case slipping from their control. Eleanor entered, her robes flowing with a quiet authority, her presence commanding the room to rise, except for Charles, who hesitated before standing, his movement grudging, a concession rather than respect. The gallery noticed, their whispers a soft ripple, but Eleanor's face remained serene, her eyes sharp as she took her place at the bench. She called the session to order, her voice steady, cutting through the tension like a beacon in fog. Today's focus was a critical piece of evidence. A recorded conversation between Clara and a senior manager, captured on her phone during a heated meeting about the factory's safety violations. Clara's heart thudded as Daniel Foster, her attorney, submitted the audio, his hands steady but his eyes bright with the weight of what it could mean. The courtroom speakers crackled to life, and Clara's voice, firm, unwavering, filled the room, detailing ignored warnings, falsified reports, and threats of retaliation. The recording was a raw wound laid bare, each word a hammer strike against Charles's empire. Clara remembered that meeting, the sterile conference room, the manager's dismissive tone, the way her hands had shaken as she pressed record, knowing it might be her only shield. Now, hearing her own voice echo in the courtroom, she felt exposed but also powerful, as if she'd reclaimed a piece of herself stolen by Charles's indifference. The gallery leaned forward, reporters' pens scratching furiously, their faces alight with the scent of a story that could topple a titan. Charles's jaw tightened, his fingers gripping the edge of the table, his composure fraying like a rope under strain. Richard whispered urgently, but Charles's eyes were locked on the speakers, as if he could silence them with his glare. Eleanor listened intently, her pen moving across her notes, her face a mask of focus. When the recording ended, she asked Daniel to clarify its context, her questions precise, drawing out the timeline of Clara's attempts to raise alarms. Daniel's responses were clear, his voice steady, painting a picture of a woman who had risked everything for the truth. Clara glanced at him, gratitude swelling in her chest. She thought of Lily, her daughter, who was probably drawing at her aunt's house, unaware of the battle her mother was fighting. The thought of Lily's small, trusting face gave Clara a surge of resolve, a reminder that this wasn't just about her, but about a world where her daughter could believe in fairness. The defense's turn came, and Richard stood, his tone smooth but strained as he argued the recording was taken out of context, a desperate move by a disgruntled employee. He called a witness, a company executive named Mark Reynolds, whose polished demeanor mirrored Charles's. Mark's testimony was slick, deflecting blame, framing Clara as an overzealous worker who misunderstood protocol. But Eleanor's questions cut through his polish, her voice calm yet relentless, exposing inconsistencies in his account. The gallery sensed the shift, their murmurs growing as Mark faltered, his confidence cracking under Eleanor's scrutiny. Clara watched, her breath shallow, feeling the tide turn but knowing Charles's resources were vast, his will unyielding. Charles leaned forward now, his eyes no longer on Eleanor but on Clara, a cold, calculating stare that sent a chill down her spine. She met his gaze, her heart pounding, refusing to look away. She remembered the factory's din, the way her warnings had been dismissed, the way her life had unraveled after speaking out. That memory fueled her, a fire that burned brighter than her fear. Eleanor, sensing the room's tension, paused to address the court, her words a reminder that the law served not the powerful but the truth. Her voice was a steady current, grounding the room, and Clara felt a flicker of hope, fragile but fierce, that justice might not be a distant dream. As the session broke for a brief recess, Charles stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor, his attorneys trailing him like shadows. Clara watched him go, his stride purposeful but his shoulders tense, as if he felt the walls closing in. She turned to Daniel, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is it enough?" she asked, her eyes searching his. He hesitated, then nodded, his expression resolute. "It's more than enough, Clara. We're close." The gallery buzzed, the air electric with anticipation. As Eleanor reviewed her notes, her face unreadable, but her presence a promise of what was to come. Clara felt the weight of the moment, the sense that the next day would bring a reckoning, a clash that would test the strength of everyone in the room. The courtroom was a crucible now, its air thick with the scent of anticipation and the faint creak of wooden benches under the weight of a rapt audience. Morning light streamed through the high windows, painting golden streaks across the marble floor, where every scuff and shadow seemed to hold a story of its own. Clara Thompson sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands steady now, though her heart raced like a drumbeat echoing her resolve. The past days had carved lines of exhaustion into her face, but her eyes burned with a quiet fire, fueled by the memory of her daughter, Lily, and the hope that truth could still prevail. Across the room, Charles Wentworth sat stiffly, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the strain in his posture. His fingers no longer drumming but clenched, as if bracing for a blow. His legal team, led by Richard Holt, shuffled papers nervously, their whispers urgent, sensing the tide had turned against them. The gallery, packed with reporters, Clara's supporters, and curious onlookers, hummed with a tension that felt alive. A collective breath held for what was to come. Judge Eleanor Harris entered, her robes sweeping the floor like a quiet tide, her presence a force that silenced the room without a word. She took her place at the bench, her dark eyes scanning the courtroom, lingering briefly on Charles, then Clara, as if measuring the weight of their souls. The bailiff called for all to rise, and this time Charles stood, his movement slow, almost reluctant, but a concession nonetheless. Clara noticed, her breath catching. His defiance was cracking, piece by piece, under Eleanor's unyielding authority. The session began with Eleanor announcing that she had reviewed all evidence, including the damning emails and the recorded conversation, and was ready to hear closing arguments. The air tightened, the gallery leaning forward, pens poised, as if the room itself knew this was the moment that would define the case. Daniel Foster rose first, his wiry frame steady, his voice resonant with the conviction of someone who believed in his cause. He spoke of Clara's courage, a single mother who risked everything to expose a truth that could save lives. He described the factory's dangers, the chemical spills, the faulty machines, the lives endangered by greed, and painted a vivid picture of a woman who stood up to a giant, not for fame or money, but for justice. His words were a tapestry of emotion, weaving Clara's struggle into a universal story of fighting against overwhelming odds. Clara listened, her eyes glistening, feeling seen in a way she hadn't since the ordeal began. She thought of Lily, of the world she wanted her daughter to inherit, one where truth mattered more than power. The gallery was silent, some wiping tears, others nodding, as Daniel's voice carried the weight of Clara's pain and hope. Richard Holt stood next, his tone polished but strained, like a man trying to hold a crumbling wall together. He argued that Clara's claims were exaggerated, that the company had followed protocol, that Charles was a visionary whose innovations had created jobs, not harm. But his words rang hollow, the emails and recording casting a shadow over his defense. Eleanor listened, her face impassive, though her eyes missed nothing, catching every falter in Richard's delivery. Charles stared straight ahead, his jaw tight, but Clara saw something new in his posture. A slump, a hint of vulnerability, as if the weight of his own actions was finally settling on his shoulders. The gallery sensed it too, their whispers growing, a murmur of justice inching closer. When Richard finished, Eleanor leaned forward, her hands folded, her voice calm but resonant, filling the room like a steady current. She spoke of the law as a shield for the vulnerable, a tool to hold the powerful accountable. She recounted the evidence. The emails, the recording, the testimonies of Sarah and Paul. Each piece a brick in a wall of truth that could not be ignored. Her words were not just legal but human, laced with a compassion that made Clara's chest ache. Eleanor addressed Charles directly, her gaze unwavering, noting his initial refusal to stand, his dismissal of the court's authority, and how it reflected a broader disregard for those he deemed beneath him. The gallery gasped softly, the air electric, as Charles's face reddened, his eyes dropping to the table for the first time. Eleanor then turned to Clara, her voice softening, acknowledging her courage, her sacrifice, the way she'd fought not just for herself but for others who would never know her name. Clara's throat tightened, tears spilling silently down her cheeks. She thought of the nights she'd doubted herself, the fear that Charles's wealth would crush her, the moments she'd nearly given up. Eleanor's words were a lifeline, pulling her back to the belief that she mattered, that her fight was worth it. The gallery was a sea of faces, some nodding, some crying, all caught in the gravity of the moment. Daniel reached for Clara's hand, squeezing it gently, his eyes shining with pride. Eleanor concluded, her voice rising slightly, a note of finality that silenced the room. She ruled in Clara's favor, ordering Charles's company to pay damages for wrongful termination and to implement immediate safety reforms. The gavel fell, a sharp crack that echoed like a thunderclap, and the gallery erupted in murmurs, applause, and gasps. Clara exhaled, her body trembling, a weight lifting from her shoulders as if she could finally breathe after months underwater. Charles sat motionless, his face pale, his hands still, as if the world he'd built was crumbling in that single sound. Richard leaned toward him, whispering, but Charles didn't respond, his eyes distant, grappling with a defeat he'd never imagined. As the courtroom began to empty, Clara lingered, watching Eleanor gather her notes, her movements calm, as if she hadn't just shifted the course of lives. Clara approached the bench, her voice shaky but clear. "Thank you," she said, her eyes meeting Eleanor's. The judge smiled, a small, genuine gesture that carried years of understanding, of battles fought in and out of courtrooms. "Keep fighting, Clara," Eleanor said softly, her words a quiet torch passed from one woman to another. Clara nodded, tears falling freely now, feeling transformed, not just by the victory, but by the realization that kindness, courage, and truth could still carve paths through injustice. Charles stood slowly, his attorneys flanking him, but his stride lacked its usual swagger as he left the courtroom. Clara watched him go, not with triumph but with a quiet resolve, knowing this moment was bigger than her, bigger than him. She thought of Lily, waiting at home, and imagined telling her this story one day, a story of standing up, of finding strength in the face of power. The courtroom emptied, but its echoes lingered, a testament to a woman who dared to speak, a judge who dared to listen, and a man forced to face the mirror of his own choices. The story wasn't just Clara's. It was a beacon for anyone who believed that even the smallest voice could change the world.